determinal point processes via distortion-free intermediate sampling by Michal Derezinski.
Thank you. So I'll be talking about algorithms for determinantal point processes. So let's first sort of motivate and define the problem. Right, so in the broadest terms, we're motivated by the question how to select a small representative sample of data. So this, as you might imagine, has applications in various settings in sort of machine learning and outside of machine learning as well, search and recommendation, text summarization, even sort of other settings such as Monte Carlo integration, experimental design. And so to make the problem slightly more concrete, suppose we're selecting out of a subset of n d-dimensional vectors, which we sort of pose as this matrix, n by d matrix X. We want to select a small subset. So now, straight off, there's the definition of the determinantal point process. So essentially, we sample a subset, and the probability to each subset is assigned to be proportional to this determinant constructed based on the sort of the submatrix based on the rows that we selected. So one thing to note is we're sampling out of all of the subsets of the data, and sort of the cool motivating property of DPPs is that even though this is sort of a combinatorial distribution, it has a closed form normalization constant. And in some settings, we want to only sample from a fixed size subsets, and that also can be done. Right, so in the settings mentioned above, in some cases, there's actual theoretical guarantees that show that DPPs can very effectively be used for this problem. There's concrete guarantees. In other cases, they just work well in practice. And just to give you some intuition of why the sample selected will be representative, so essentially the connection here is between the determinant and the volume. So essentially the determinant that the probability is proportional to is the volume squared spanned by the vectors that we select. And so in a picture, right, if we have two vectors, that means we're looking at the volume of that parallelogram. And as we can see, if the vectors are not very diverse, if they're very similar to each other, then the volume will be small. So that's how we're sort of favoring diversity, and that makes the sample more representative. So now, what are the algorithmic challenges with sampling from DPPs? So first of all, it's not obvious that this can be done in polynomial time, but that has been shown. But still, there's certain bottlenecks. First one is as expensive pre-processing steps. So that typically involves exact SVD decomposition of the whole data matrix X. And the other sort of bottleneck is when we want to sample repeatedly from this distribution, which is needed often in practice, the cost of each sampling scales with the size of the entire data rather than the size of the subset we would like to sample from. And in addressing this problem, in the existing literature sort of runs into those trade-offs between accuracy and runtime in the sense that we can either come up with exact algorithms and pay the expensive cost, or we can come up with approximate algorithms, in which case it's sort of often difficult to sort of say how approximate are they. So I'll right now select a very small representative sample of the related work. And so the sort of the classic result here by Hugh, Krishnapur, Perez, and Virag is an exact algorithm which indeed uses SVD decomposition of X, which costs ND squared time. And they propose this nice bottom-up sampling algorithm, which essentially draws one point at a time and has to update the sort of probability distribution of each next point being sampled, because it's a joint distribution. So that's why this is sort of still relatively expensive, but cheaper than the SVD decomposition. So to summarize, the cost we pay is when we receive the matrix X, the first sample we draw, generally the cost we pay is for the pre-processing, which is the SVD, and the second sample we draw we only have to pay for the sampling cost, which is here, n k squared. K here represents basically the subset size. So another approach that was designed to address the problem of having to compute the SVD decomposition is to use a approximate sort of sampler with a Markov chain whose stationary distribution is the DPP, or in this case, KDPP. And so, so the key result showed that a very natural, simple Markov chain in fact mixes fast, and they showed, Anarigaran and Rezai showed that it converges to with an epsilon total variation distance of the true distribution. And here, the cost of every sample is the same. It may be less than the SVD, but it's still somewhat expensive because we have to converge every time. We have to converge again with the Markov chain. So now, okay, so this is the prior work. So let's talk about the main result. Okay, so let me sort of parse this quickly for you. So basically, given a matrix X and some additional approximately pre-computed quantities, we have an algorithm that samples from a DPP in time. So if you have order d cubed k. So the remarkable thing to note is that there's no n in the runtime here, right? Which was there in all the previous cases. And to look at the guarantee, there's this raw term. Essentially, the algorithm samples from the DPP of x, but the x might be slightly rescaled, which is sort of a strictly stronger guarantee than the one, for example, given by the MCMC, the total variation distance guarantee. So, of course, to sample the first sample, the S1, we actually have to compute the approximate quantities, right? This is, so I sort of describe them on a high level as computing a subspace embedding and computing the ridge level scores. You may be familiar with those terms. Those are standard terms, and there's a standard methods to actually approximate them. And this can be done in sort of input sparsity time, so essentially linear time in the size of the data. And after that, for each next sample, we only have to pay the cost of the algorithm, which is independent of n. So just to quickly go over the main idea, the distortion-free intermediate sampling. The idea is to essentially, before we sample the target subset S, we're going to sample a bigger intermediate sample sigma in a very particular way so that we can downsample the subset S. But the crucial property that we will achieve, which is sort of maybe surprising, is that the intermediate sample does not in any way distort the distribution of the target sample. So what that means is that essentially every time we draw a new sample S, we're going to first sample a sigma, then we sample out of that, we sample an S, and it's as if we never sampled the sample sigma because it's distortion-free. And so to do that, we propose this regularized determinantal point process. So I will not have a chance to get into the details, but so here is a definition. There's, of course, more details at the poster. Essentially, there's this identity matrix that regularizes the determinant, and the key sort of result we obtain is that this RDPP is a distortion-free intermediate sample for DPP, and this is sort of a more general approach that could be applied to other distributions than DPPs potentially. And of course, also we have to show that this is efficient. This can be efficiently sampled from, so I will not discuss that here. But to summarize, we show here that we can sample from DPPs with input sparsity time preprocessing and sampling time that does not depend on n at all. And so, yeah, for more details, come to the poster. And if you're interested, there's a follow-up work by me, Daniela Calandriel, and Michal Walko, where we sort of extend the results to kernelized DPPs and make some additional improvements. Thank you. It is stronger in the sense that, so in the paper, if you look in the paper, I essentially show that, so I show this guarantee that I showed here, and I also show that it implies a total variation distance of epsilon as well. So in that sense, it implies this guarantee, but also it's sort of more useful in other settings.
Any other questions? If not, let's thank the speaker again.